911, do you need police, fire, medical?
My daughter's dead. She just had to go in there.
Sir, did she hang herself?
No, she didn't hang herself, but
How old is she?
around her. She's 11 years old.
On November 29th, 2001, 12-year-old Amanda Cope was found strangled to death in her own bed in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Sadly, her own father, Billy Cope, was the one to find her. He immediately went into a state of shock. However, when the police arrived to investigate, they found a very suspicious scene. Who could have done such a thing to a sweet 12-year-old child? And who was the police's main suspect in the case? Welcome back to Mysterious 7, where we shed light on high-profile and under-the-radar cases from across the globe. Today we'll be looking at the case of Billy Cope, a case with more twists in it than you would ever expect. But first, if you haven't subscribed to our channel by now, please consider hitting the subscribe and like buttons. Now, let's dive right in without any further ado.
Is she breathing?
Oh, no, she's dead.
She's
She's cold as a cucumber. And,
okay, you don't want to try to CPR or anything on her?
no, ma'am, she's dead. I mean, her mouth is completely shut. She's ice cold.
Okay, when was the last time you saw her live, sir?
About 2 o'clock this morning.
About 2 o'clock this morning. Has she been
1 o'clock this morning.
Has she been sick or anything?
No, ma'am. The thing was just wrapped around her neck.
Was it her bed clothing or her sheet?
It was her blanket. She just had a blanket laying there, and she rolled over and it wrapped around her neck. It's the green thing on the blanket. She laid on the green blanket with a green blanket, and it had a string wrapped around it. I mean, I gotta call my wife.
Okay. Okay, what kind of house do you live in, sir? What color is your house?
It's white, but she's gone on to be with the Lord because she was a Christian. Please, I really
Okay. All right, sir.
I have my light on.
All right, sir.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
That chilling recording you just heard was the 911 call that 37-year-old Billy Cope made when he found his daughter Amanda dead in her bedroom. In the early hours of November 29th, 2001, in Rock Hill, South Carolina, Billy Cope woke up with a start at around 3 a.m. and immediately knew something was wrong in his house. The hall light was on, and he distinctly remembered turning it off before going to bed. His wife, Mary Sue, was out at her overnight job where she cleaned offices, so it was just him and his 3 girls, Amanda, Jessica, and Kyla, at home. Amanda was the oldest at 12 years old, while Jessica and Kyla were 11 and 7 respectively. A devoutly Christian family, they'd missed the Wednesday church service they usually attended that night because Jessica was struggling with her math homework and needed some extra help to complete her assignment. Amanda, always the caring older sister, had offered to help her, and Billy agreed to let the 2 girls stay up as long as was needed to complete the work. The youngest daughter, Kyla, had gone to bed at 9 p.m., but Billy stayed up with the older 2 sisters till 1 a.m., helping them finish their schoolwork. Afterwards, they all headed to bed to get some much-needed rest, and Billy had turned on his CPAP breathing machine that he used to keep his sleep apnea at bay before drifting to sleep. Strangely, just 2 hours later, he was awoken by something. Still half asleep, Billy went to check on his daughters. Amanda's door was shut, and he concluded that perhaps she was the one who turned on the hall light. Maybe she'd gotten up in the middle of the night for a drink of water. The other bedroom door was open, and he saw his 2 younger girls fast asleep in their beds. With his mind more at ease, he returned to his bed, put his breathing machine back on, and quickly fell back to sleep. The following morning at 6 a.m., Billy was awoken by the blaring of his alarm clock. He later stated that during those intermittent hours of sleep, he dreamed about the rapture. In his dream, Jesus had returned to take his followers home. He explained that in his dream, he saw Amanda being taken and him being left behind, with her saying the words, "Bye, Daddy," to him. Still feeling jarred from his intense dream, he quickly left his bed to check on his daughters. He was overwhelmed with relief when he saw his 2 younger girls still sleeping peacefully in their beds. But his comfort was short-lived. As he tried to open Amanda's door, it was caught on the open closet door behind it. After using force to get through the door, he witnessed an unbearable sight. Amanda's body was lying limp on her bed. When he went to touch her, she was ice cold, and he knew that his nightmare had come true. He then covered her and, still in a state of shock, dialed 911. Within minutes, paramedics from the fire department arrived at the scene, but their life-saving gear was useless. Amanda was, indeed, gone. Jason Dillon from the Rock Hill Fire Department asked Billy what he thought had happened, and Billy told him that he thought she may have choked on her blanket as she had a history of rolling in her sleep. Detectives arrived soon after and secured the house as an active crime scene and began an investigation. The detectives were immediately suspicious of Billy's reaction to his daughter's death. His calm demeanor seemed unnatural, and he did not display much emotion at all. Soon, dozens of investigators filled the tiny house looking for clues, but the house was a mess, with the family's belongings cluttering every room. There were clothes piled on every surface, dishes overflowing out of the sinks, cockroaches scurrying into the corners. In the midst of this, Amanda's body lay fully clothed on her bed, surrounded by her books and recent school pictures that she'd just gotten back from the photographer. When the body was examined, investigators found that she'd been beaten and strangled to death after being assaulted. There were bruises on her body, and physical evidence was found on her clothes. The evidence was collected in the hopes that it could be used in identifying the killer. While processing the house for clues, police found another oddity. After examining all the doors and the windows, they realized that there were no signs of forced entry into the home. All the entrances were locked from the inside. This indicated to investigators that the killer likely came from within the house. The detectives spoke to Billy and asked him how he thought Amanda had died. Billy claimed that she may have been strangled by her blanket in her sleep, which was not in line with the evidence at the crime scene. Detectives knew they needed to dig deeper. Upon looking into his background, they learned that 2 years prior, he and his wife had both pleaded guilty to neglecting the proper care of their children. This was the final piece of information that they needed. Along with his emotionless reaction to her death, his bizarre explanation of how she died, and the fact that there were no signs of forced entry into the house, it seemed to the police that Billy was clearly the prime suspect in their case. They immediately took him downtown to the police station for more intense questioning. Over the next few days, detectives grilled Billy mercilessly. He faced over 17 hours of interrogation over the next 4 days. On the first day of interrogation, the 29th of November 2001, the same day of the murder, Billy was questioned for 3.5 hours by detectives. As a result of this initial questioning, detectives had no doubt that he had committed the terrible crime. All they needed from him was a confession. But on that first day, Billy insisted that he was innocent again and again, over 650 times according to the recordings of the interrogations. He told the police that he loved his daughters, and there was no way he would have ever hurt Amanda. He claimed that the only reason he didn't hear anything that night was because the machine he used for his sleep apnea was very loud and it drowned out any outside noise. This seemed unlikely to the investigators, who continued to probe Billy to see if they could get a confession out of him. However, Billy would not admit to the crime. They tried to use his faith against him, saying he'd burn in hell for what he did. They also tried to tell him once the physical evidence they had collected came back as a match to him, he'd have nowhere to hide. Yet, no matter what they said, Billy continued to deny any involvement in the murder of his daughter. Finally, as they entered the 4th hour of questioning on the second day, Billy asked for a polygraph or lie detector test, believing it would be what finally convinced them of his innocence. Unfortunately, this would be where it all began to unravel for Billy. Not long after beginning his polygraph, the individual conducting the test slammed his hand down on the table and told the detectives that they had enough to end the test. He looked Billy in the eye and told him he'd failed the test. Billy was devastated. Following these results, detectives pressed Billy further, wanting to know why he'd done this terrible thing to his daughter. Slowly, Billy began to talk. Billy eventually confessed, yet he seemed unsure of his own statements. The first confession ended with him signing a written statement of what he'd done, admitting to killing his own daughter. But that would not be all. By the end of the fourth day of the interrogation, Billy had given a total of 4 different confessions to the police, and none of them matched each other or aligned with the evidence at the crime scene. In one, Amanda was beaten with a broom, but this was not mentioned in any of his other confessions. Some confessions included a dream, yet in other statements, the dream was excluded, or a very different version of the dream was told. None of the details from each individual confession lined up with one another. Regardless of this, detectives accepted them as the truth, even though they believed Billy to be severely mentally disturbed. The fourth and final confession was a video reenactment, where the police took him back to his house and taped him as he went over what he did the night of the murder. Eventually, due to his many confessions, Billy was charged as the sole perpetrator in the murder of his daughter. However, after these long interrogations, Billy retracted all of his confessions and again protested his innocence in court. Nonetheless, the damage was done, and Billy was sent to prison with no bond or any form of bail. It seemed like the case was done and dusted. A year had passed since the murder. Billy had confessed to the crime, and many people, even those who knew him, were now convinced that he was indeed guilty. But Billy himself was now once again professing his innocence. Phil Beatty, a private attorney from Rock Hill, was now charged to fight this case in court for him. Phil admits that the first time he met Billy, he thought he was guilty. His strategy for the case was to try and get Billy the best plea deal possible and just put the case to rest. However, after speaking to Billy about the process of his interrogation in the initial days after the murder, Beatty was disturbed by what he'd heard. When his court-assigned public defender, B.J. Barrowclough, had arrived at the police station, the police did not allow him to the interrogation room to see Billy, a clear violation of his rights. They produced a note that Billy had allegedly signed, which stated that he did not want to see his attorney at that time. When Barrowclough argued that they could have coerced him into signing this note, they simply refused to let him ask his client himself. It was only after this fourth confession that his defense attorney, B.J. Barrowclough, was allowed to see him. When he asked Billy why he'd signed the confession, Billy replied that the police had told him he'd get the death penalty if he didn't sign it. Beatty was shocked at the clear violation of Billy's rights. However, since the confessions had been written and signed, he was unsure if this information would aid in his case. In an unexpected turn of events, in late 2002, Beatty got a call from the prosecutor's office asking for a meeting. Believing this was in regards to a deal for his client, he agreed to meet with them, but he could never have expected what they were about to tell him. As they sat him down, they explained to him that the DNA found on Amanda's body had finally been processed, and, to the surprise of everyone, the DNA was not Billy's. Beatty was shocked, but also happy to hear this news, because it now meant that his client was innocent and he had a real chance to win this case. But what they would tell him next would shock him even more. He was told that the police had been aware within a few weeks of the murder that the DNA was not a match to Billy, but had kept this information to themselves for over a year. This infuriated Beatty to no end. He could not believe such a grievous miscarriage of justice had been carried out, and that no one had thought this information was important enough to inform Billy's lawyers about it before this time. But then he stopped and asked why they decided to tell him this information now, after all these months, if they'd known it was not Billy's DNA all that time ago. And that is when the final piece of information was revealed to him. He was told that the reason he was being told all of this now was that the police had found a match to the DNA in the system, and they knew whose it was. It belonged to a man named James Sanders. There's not much information known about James Sanders' past, where he came from, or what he was doing prior to 2001. All that's known is he was a career criminal who had committed a variety of crimes prior to this horrific one. He'd been released from prison and moved into the same neighborhood as the Copes only about 2 weeks prior to him killing Amanda. He lived in a house only 2 blocks away from where Billy and his family lived. There's no evidence present that the two men knew each other, and they certainly would have made an unusual pair. Billy Cope was, in the words of his lawyer, a socially isolated 385-pound white man. He was also a devout Christian and aspiring preacher. James Sanders, on the other hand, was an African-American career criminal and drug addict who'd recently gotten out of prison. In the 6 weeks following Amanda's murder in November 2001, Sanders committed or attempted to commit 4 more sexual assaults in the neighborhood. Now that his attorneys knew there was another man whose DNA had been found at the scene of the crime, they realized that Billy was factually innocent. They then questioned him seriously as to why he had provided false confessions to the police when he was interrogated right after the murder occurred. Billy told his lawyers that when he was questioned by the police in the hours following the murder, he had been sure of his innocence. But he'd also been in a state of shock, having just lost his daughter in such a traumatic manner. Due to this, he may have appeared emotionless to them. He also told them that he'd provided false confessions in an effort to confuse the police. He believed that his confessions would not carry any weight unless police were able to prove them, and he didn't believe the evidence would point to any of his confessions being legitimate. However, in this matter, he was wrong, as the police were willing to accept his confessions, even though none of them matched each other, or indeed the evidence found at the scene. Despite Sanders being identified as being present the night that Amanda was killed, Billy was still charged with the crime. The case went to trial in 2004, and the trial was centered around both sides trying to prove what actually had taken place the night of the murder. While Billy's lawyers argued that Billy was not involved in his daughter's death in any manner, the prosecutors found a simple explanation for both Billy's confessions and the new DNA evidence that had been found. They said that the only logical explanation was that both men were in on it and had carried out the crime together. The prosecutors alleged that this is why there were no signs of forced entry into the house, as Billy had let Sanders in and then locked up again once he'd left. Cope's attorneys said prosecutors were just trying to present the evidence in this manner so they could cover up their inappropriate interrogation tactics. They argued that Cope had mental issues and was so devastated by his daughter's death that detectives were able to manipulate him into confessing to a crime he did not commit. The defense was also not allowed to present crucial evidence to the jury due to Judge John C. Hayes III not allowing it on the grounds of it leading the jury to a logical fallacy. The evidence that was excluded was the fact that in the 4 sexual assaults that Sanders had committed or attempted in the weeks following Amanda's murder, there was never any sign of forced entry. It certainly appears that Sanders was a master at breaking and entering and left no evidence for even the most seasoned of detectives to find. Another key piece of evidence the defense lawyers were not allowed to present to the jury was the testimony from a jailhouse informant who claimed he'd overheard Sanders say he had raped and killed a little girl in Rock Hill. These sorts of testimonies are often allowed by courts when they help prosecutors, but in this case, when it could have helped the defendant, it was not allowed. While it may seem clear to you that Billy was not involved in his daughter's death at all, this is not how the jury ended up seeing it. Both Sanders and Billy were convicted and were charged with conspiracy, which means they collaborated with each other to commit the crime. They were each given life sentences without the chance of parole in 2004. In April 2009, the verdict was appealed, and a 3-judge panel from the South Carolina Court of Appeals reversed the conspiracy conviction, ruling that there was no evidence that Cope and Sanders knew each other. However, the South Carolina Attorney General appealed this decision soon after, and the decision was overturned. In 2013, the state Supreme Court upheld Cope's conviction, and the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear his case. Despite all the evidence seemingly pointing towards Billy's innocence, he remained behind bars. On February 9, 2017, at the age of 53, Billy Cope died of natural causes in state custody. He never got to see the outside of a jail cell after being charged with the murder of his own daughter. Whether or not he was actually guilty, we leave for you to decide. And there we have it, folks. The tragic tale of the murder of Amanda Cope and the nightmare ordeal that followed for her father, Billy. What do you think of the case? Do you think Billy was innocent or guilty? More importantly, was justice served for Amanda Cope? Let us know your opinions in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed the video, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, stay safe and thanks for watching.